Hey guys, tonight we're looking at one of the most ordinary foods in history and one of the most misunderstood. Bread seems simple, almost too familiar to notice. But if you go back into the medieval world, it starts to look less like a side dish and more like the foundation of civilization itself. It fed peasants, sustained monks, supported armies, and quietly shaped the rhythm of daily life from the village oven to the Lord's table. And the strange twist is this: the bread many medieval people depended on every day was often slower to make, less refined, and in some ways far closer to real nourishment than the soft, uniform loaves stacked in modern supermarket aisles. Before we begin, if you enjoy calm, thoughtful history like this, consider subscribing. A lot of regular listeners do, simply so they don't miss future long-form stories, and it really helps this channel keep making careful, in-depth documentaries. Now, with that said, let's step back into medieval Europe and look at why bread was not just food, but survival, status, technology, religion, and daily energy all at once. To understand why medieval bread could feel almost like a superfood, we first have to understand what bread meant in the Middle Ages. In the modern English-speaking world, bread is often treated as optional. It sits beside the meal or becomes a quick convenience food. In medieval Europe, bread was the meal for enormous numbers of people. In many regions, it supplied a major share of daily calories, and that meant people thought about it very differently. A failed bread harvest was not an inconvenience. It was a crisis. Good bread was not a lifestyle choice. It was the difference between strength and weakness, work and hunger, stability and unrest. When a food becomes that central, societies invest deeply in making it filling, usable, and reliable. Medieval bread was also deeply tied to the agricultural year. Most people lived much closer to the land than modern consumers do, so they knew, either directly or through local custom, where flour came from, what weather had done to grain, how mills performed, and whether this year's loaf would be heavier, darker, rougher, or more expensive. Wheat was prized in many places for making lighter, finer bread, especially among wealthier households, but a great many people relied on rye, barley, oats, maslin mixtures, and other grains depending on region, climate, and class. That diversity mattered. Medieval bread was not one standardized product made to look and taste identical every week of the year. It changed with soil, season, storage, local economy, and the social rank of the person eating it. In other words, bread remained connected to the real world that produced it. That connection begins with the grain itself. Modern industrial bread is often made from highly refined flour, stripped down for consistency, shelf life, and texture. Medieval flour, by contrast, was usually less refined, especially for ordinary people. Even when sifted, it was rarely processed to the extreme whiteness that later centuries came to admire. More of the grain remained in the loaf. That usually meant more bran, more germ, more variation, and a denser structure. Could be coarse, could be heavy, could also be much more sustaining. A laborer working fields, chopping wood, carrying water, or repairing roads did not need bread that vanished the moment it was chewed. He needed bread that released energy steadily, sat firmly in the stomach, and helped power long hours of physical work. Medieval bread, especially darker breads and mixed-grain loaves, often did exactly that. This is one of the reasons the modern comparison can feel so surprising. When people hear the phrase medieval bread, they sometimes imagine something primitive, dirty, or nutritionally poor. But from the standpoint of satiety and whole food structure, a coarse medieval loaf could be remarkably functional. It contained more of the original grain, often fermented more slowly, and was usually made with fewer purely cosmetic goals in mind. It was not designed to stay pillow soft for days under plastic wrapping. It was not designed to be sweet enough to appeal instantly. It was designed to feed human beings who worked hard and who could not afford food that failed to satisfy. The method mattered just as much as the ingredients. For much of the medieval period, leavened bread depended on natural fermentation, often through some form of sourdough culture or retained starter. In practical terms, that meant time. Dough developed more slowly, flavor deepened, texture changed gradually. Bakers worked within living processes rather than forcing fast results. Fermentation was not marketed as a wellness trend. It was simply how bread was commonly made. And although medieval people would not have used modern nutritional language, slow fermentation often made bread more digestible for many eaters and gave it a complexity that industrial speed baking tends to flatten. A loaf shaped by time behaves differently from a loaf rushed through production. There is also the question of what medieval people ate bread with. Bread rarely existed in isolation. It absorbed pottages, accompanied cheese, supported onions and herbs, stretched stews, paired with ale, and formed part of a wider food system that, while limited by season and status, was often less dominated by ultra-processed combinations than many modern diets. For poor households, bread was a base that made other foods go further. For monasteries, it fit into disciplined routines of fasting and feasting. For elites, fine white bread could be a marker of privilege, but even then bread remained central, not incidental. Across social ranks, it functioned as a nutritional anchor. That does not mean all medieval bread was ideal. Far from it. Bad harvests, adulterated flour, careless milling, spoilage, and regional scarcity could all make bread worse. Some loaves were inferior, some were stretched with cheaper grains, and in times of famine people resorted to substitutes that were far from nourishing. We should not romanticize the Middle Ages into a lost paradise of perfect artisanal eating. Medieval life was harder, riskier, and often nutritionally precarious. But the ordinary baseline loaf, especially in more stable years, was frequently built around slower methods and less refined ingredients than modern mass-market bread. That is the important comparison. Not perfection against failure, but real food against heavily optimized convenience. To see why modern bread so often feels different, we need to jump forward many centuries. The industrialization of milling transformed flour. Roller mills, fine refining, and the commercial drive for whiteness and uniformity changed what bread was made from and what consumers expected it to look like. White bread became cleaner, softer, and more socially desirable. In some periods, it was a symbol of progress. But nutritionally, that progress came with trade-offs. The more grain is broken apart and separated, the more its original structure disappears. What remains may bake beautifully and store efficiently, but it can lose much of the complexity that once made bread sustaining. Later industrial baking added more speed, more control, and more additives to maintain softness, appearance, and shelf stability. Bread increasingly became an engineered product. And this is where the title's contrast begins to make sense. Medieval bread could feel like a superfood not because medieval people possessed secret nutritional knowledge, but because necessity pushed bread production towards slower, less refined, more grain-complete forms. Their bread had to nourish. It had to hold people through labor and uncertainty. Modern industrial bread, on the other hand, often succeeds first as a commercial object. It must be cheap, predictable, transportable, attractive, and long-lasting. Those are powerful incentives, but they are not the same as nourishment. A loaf can be visually perfect and still leave a person feeling oddly unsatisfied. Can be easy to chew, easy to buy, and easy to overeat, while delivering a much narrower experience of what bread once was. Medieval bakers also worked within a world where flour was local in a way modern consumers rarely experience. Grain traveled, of course, and trade mattered, but the typical loaf still reflected local mills, nearby fields, and regional custom. Water, weather, storage conditions, and even the heat of the communal oven shaped the outcome. That gave bread variation. Some loaves were sourer, some denser, some darker, some more mixed in grain composition. Modern food systems usually interpret variation as a problem. Medieval food systems accepted variation as reality. In a subtle way, that acceptance may have preserved nutritional richness, because bread was not endlessly stripped and corrected until every loaf lost its individuality. Even social hierarchy tells us something important here. Medieval elites often preferred the whitest, finest bread because whiteness signaled expense, labor, and privilege. Darker bread was associated with lower rank. Yet, from a modern nutritional perspective, those humbler loaves were often the more substantial ones. History is full of these reversals. The food that looked prestigious was not always the food that best sustained the body. The food of necessity could carry hidden strengths. What the medieval poor ate by constraint is sometimes rediscovered by modern consumers as authenticity, fiber, fermentation, and whole grain quality. There was also a practical intelligence built into medieval food culture. Bread needed to last, but not in the way factory bread lasts. A good loaf could go stale and still remain useful. It could be toasted, soaked, turned into trenchers, broken into broth, or reworked in the kitchen. Staleness was not always waste. Modern packaged bread, by contrast, often aims to remain unnaturally soft, which can come at the cost of flavor and structure. Medieval households expected bread to change over time and knew how to use it at each stage. That relationship encouraged respect for the loaf as a serious staple rather than a disposable filler. So when we ask why medieval bread could seem almost like a superfood, the answer is not a single magical ingredient. It is the whole system around it. Less refined grain, slower fermentation, stronger ties to local agriculture, greater reliance on mixed grains, fewer industrial shortcuts, a social world in which bread had to carry real nutritional weight. Medieval people did not eat this way because they were enlightened health reformers. They ate this way because bread mattered too much to be trivial. And perhaps that is the biggest lesson of all. In the medieval world, bread was not treated as empty. It was treated as life. In the next part, we'll look more closely at how medieval grain, milling, class divisions, and baking methods shaped the actual loaf people ate, from the darker breads of rural households to the prized white loaves of the wealthy, and why that gap between status and nourishment reveals so much about the history of food. When we look more closely at the bread itself, one of the most revealing details is the type of grain that went into it. Medieval Europe was not dominated by a single standardized wheat supply. Instead, agriculture was regional, adaptive, and often unpredictable. In northern and eastern regions, rye was far more reliable than wheat, especially in colder or poorer soils. Barley and oats also played a significant role, particularly among rural communities. What this meant in practice was that bread often reflected a blend of grains rather than a purified, single-ingredient product. These mixtures, sometimes referred to as maslin bread, combined wheat with rye or other cereals. They were not created as a nutritional experiment, but as a practical solution to agricultural limits. Yet, unintentionally, they produced loaves with broader nutritional profiles and slower digestion compared to highly refined wheat bread. This diversity of grains also had an impact on how people experienced fullness and energy. A dense rye loaf behaves very differently in the body than a light, refined wheat loaf. It takes longer to break down, releases energy more gradually, and tends to keep hunger away for longer periods. For a medieval laborer, this mattered enormously. Daily life was physically demanding in ways that are difficult to fully imagine today. Even routine tasks like walking between villages, carrying water, grinding grain, or working fields required sustained energy output. Bread that could support that level of activity was not simply appreciated, it was essential. In that sense, the structure of medieval bread aligned closely with the energy demands of medieval life. The process of milling grain also played a central role in shaping bread quality. In the medieval world, grain was typically ground using millstones, either powered by water or wind. These mills crushed the grain in a way that preserved more of its natural components. The flour produced was variable, sometimes coarse, sometimes finer depending on the skill of the miller and the quality of the equipment, but it generally retained more of the grain's original character. By contrast, modern roller milling separates the grain into distinct parts, removing bran and germ to produce a uniform white flour. While this creates consistency and a longer shelf life, it also strips away much of what made traditional bread more sustaining. Milling itself was not just a technical process, it was also part of the medieval economic system. Many peasants were required to use the lord's mill and pay a portion of their grain as a fee. This meant that access to properly milled flour was tied to feudal obligations. Poorer households might end up with rougher flour or attempt to grind grain themselves using simpler tools, leading to heavier, more textured bread. Yet even in these conditions, the resulting loaves often contained more of the whole grain than modern industrial bread. Again, this was not a deliberate nutritional choice, but a consequence of limited processing technology. Baking methods added another layer of complexity. In many villages, bread was baked in communal ovens. These ovens were heated with wood, and once they reached the right temperature, multiple households would bring their prepared dough to be baked. Timing mattered, and so did skill. A baker needed to understand heat, fermentation, and dough consistency without the aid of modern measurements or controlled environments. This created a culture of practical knowledge, passed down through generations. Bread making was not automated. It required attention, patience, and experience. The use of sourdough or naturally leavened starters further distinguished medieval bread from much of what is common today. A starter culture is a living system of wild yeast and bacteria, maintained over time and used to ferment dough. This process breaks down certain components of the grain, changes the flavor, and alters the texture of the bread. It also introduces a level of variability, as each starter develops its own characteristics based on environment, temperature, and handling. Medieval bakers worked with these living systems as a normal part of daily life. They did not speed up fermentation with industrial yeast or tightly controlled processes. Instead, they allowed time to do the work. This slower approach had consequences for both flavor and digestion. Bread developed deeper, more complex tastes, often slightly sour or earthy, depending on the grain and fermentation time. It also tended to be more satisfying in smaller quantities. Modern bread, by contrast, is often designed for immediate appeal. It is soft, mild, and easy to consume quickly. This can make it less filling, encouraging people to eat more without necessarily feeling nourished. The difference is subtle but significant. Medieval bread asked more of the eater in terms of chewing and digestion, but in return it often provided a stronger sense of satiety. Social class continued to shape bread in important ways. Wealthier households had access to finer flour, often made from carefully sifted wheat. This produced lighter, whiter bread, which became a symbol of status. The whiter the bread, the higher its perceived quality. Dark bread, associated with rye or mixed grains, was often seen as inferior, something eaten by peasants or the poor. Yet from a modern perspective, this hierarchy can seem inverted. The darker breads, richer in whole grain components, may have offered more sustained nourishment, while the prized white bread was closer to a refined luxury. Even the way bread was used at the table reveals its importance. In many medieval settings, bread functioned as more than just food. Thick slices of stale bread, known as trenchers, were used as plates to hold meat and other dishes. They absorbed sauces and juices, becoming part of the meal itself. Afterward, they might be eaten or given to the poor. This practice shows how bread was integrated into every part of eating, not just as a side item but as a structural element of the meal. Nothing was wasted, and bread served multiple purposes beyond simple consumption. Religious life also reinforced the centrality of bread. In Christian Europe, bread held symbolic significance, particularly in the context of the Eucharist. This elevated bread from a daily necessity to something with spiritual meaning. Monasteries often became centers of agricultural and baking knowledge, refining techniques and maintaining consistent production. Monks followed strict dietary routines, and bread was a constant presence within those rhythms. The discipline of monastic life, with its balance of labor and prayer, further emphasized the role of simple, sustaining foods. It is also important to recognize that medieval bread was not always ideal. There were times when grain supplies were poor, leading to bread made with inferior or even harmful ingredients. In years of famine, people resorted to stretching flour with whatever they could find, including roots or other substitutes that were far from nutritious. Bread could become a vehicle for survival rather than nourishment. So while medieval bread often had qualities that we now associate with healthier eating, it existed within a system that was far less secure than our own. The variability was much greater, and the consequences of failure were severe. Still, when conditions were stable, the everyday loaf carried a kind of practical efficiency. It delivered energy, supported labor, and fit into a broader diet that, while limited, was less dominated by highly processed foods. Medieval people did not have access to modern convenience, but they also did not rely on it. Their bread was part of a slower, more grounded food system, one that prioritized function over uniformity. As we move further forward in time, the contrast becomes sharper. The Industrial Revolution introduced new technologies that transformed both milling and baking. Flour became finer, whiter, and more consistent. Bread became softer, lighter, and easier to produce at scale. These changes made bread more accessible in some ways, but they also shifted its role. It became less about sustaining hard labor and more about fitting into a fast-paced urban lifestyle. Convenience began to outweigh tradition. Understanding medieval bread, then, is not about romanticizing the past or rejecting the present. It is about recognizing how different systems produce different kinds of food. Medieval bread was shaped by necessity, locality, and time. Modern bread is shaped by efficiency, scale, and consumer expectation. Both have their place, but they are not the same. And when we look closely, it becomes clear why a simple medieval loaf could feel, in its own context, like something far more substantial than the bread many people are used to today. In the next section, we'll explore how the transition from medieval to early modern and industrial baking changed not just bread itself, but the way people thought about food, health, and what it meant to feel truly nourished. As we move from the late medieval period into the early modern world, the story of bread begins to shift in a way that is both subtle and profound. The change did not happen all at once. There was no single moment when traditional bread disappeared and modern bread took its place. Instead, it unfolded gradually, shaped by technology, urban growth, economic pressure, and changing cultural ideas about what food should look like and feel like. One of the most important turning points was the development of more advanced milling techniques. By the 18th and especially the 19th century, roller mills began to replace traditional stone grinding in many parts of Europe and North America. This new system allowed millers to separate the grain into distinct components with far greater precision. The bran and germ could be removed almost completely, leaving behind a very fine, pale flour. This flour was easier to work with, more predictable in baking, and could be stored for longer periods without spoiling. At first glance, this seemed like progress, and in many ways it was. Bread became more consistent. Bakers could produce loaves that looked nearly identical from day to day. Urban populations, which were growing rapidly during industrialization, could be supplied more efficiently. But something important was lost in the process. When the grain is separated so completely, much of its original structure disappears. The flour becomes lighter, but also simpler. The resulting bread is softer, but often less sustaining. This shift also aligned with changing social values. For centuries, white bread had been associated with wealth and status. Now, with industrial milling, it became widely available. What was once a luxury could now be produced in large quantities for ordinary people. In a cultural sense, this felt like an improvement. People who had once eaten coarse, dark bread could now enjoy loaves that were lighter and more refined. But nutritionally, the change was more complicated. The qualities that made white bread appealing, its softness, its mild flavor, its visual purity, were not necessarily the same qualities that made bread deeply nourishing. At the same time, the pace of life was changing. Industrial cities operated on schedules that were very different from rural, agrarian communities. Workers needed food that was quick, convenient, and easy to consume. Bread began to adapt to this new reality. Baking processes were streamlined. Fermentation times were shortened. Eventually, commercial yeast allowed bread to rise much faster than traditional sourdough methods. What had once been a slow, living process became increasingly controlled and accelerated. This transformation had a direct impact on how bread felt in the body. Faster fermentation means less time for the natural breakdown of certain grain components. The bread may rise beautifully and taste mild, but it can also feel less satisfying. It digests differently. It may not provide the same steady release of energy that slower, denser loaves once did. Again, medieval bakers did not understand this in modern scientific terms, but their methods often produced bread that aligned more closely with long-term nourishment simply because they allowed time to do its work. Another important factor was the rise of commercial baking at scale. Bread was no longer just something made in small batches by local bakers or households. It became an industrial product, produced in large quantities, packaged, transported, and sold across wide regions. This required a new set of priorities. Bread needed to last longer without going stale. It needed to maintain a consistent texture and appearance. It needed to appeal to a broad range of consumers. These demands led to the introduction of additives and processing techniques designed to stabilize and standardize the product. From a business perspective, this made perfect sense. But from a historical perspective, it marked a clear departure from the medieval approach. Bread was no longer deeply tied to local grain, local water, and local baking traditions. It became part of a global system shaped by efficiency and market demand. The loaf was no longer a reflection of its immediate environment. It was a product designed to meet expectations. This is where the comparison between medieval and modern bread becomes especially interesting. When people say that modern bread makes you sick, they are often expressing a feeling rather than a precise medical claim. What they are noticing is a difference in how bread behaves. It may feel less filling. It may be easier to overeat. It may not provide the same sense of steady energy. These experiences can be traced back, at least in part, to the structural changes in flour and baking methods over time. Medieval bread, by contrast, was not optimized for convenience. It was not designed to be eaten quickly or in large quantities without thought. It required effort to chew, time to digest, and attention to prepare. It existed within a slower rhythm of life. And because of that, it often supported that rhythm more effectively. It fit into a world where meals were simpler, portions were more deliberate, and food was closely tied to physical activity. There is also a psychological dimension to consider. In the medieval world, bread was valued. It was respected as a central part of survival. Waste was avoided. Meals were structured around it. In the modern world, bread is abundant and often taken for granted. It is easy to ignore, easy to replace, easy to consume without thinking. That shift in perception can change how people relate to food in general. When something becomes too easy, it can lose its sense of importance. At the same time, it would be a mistake to suggest that medieval bread was universally superior in every way. Modern systems have brought undeniable benefits. Food safety has improved. Supply chains are more reliable. Bread is widely accessible, even in regions where local grain production is limited. People are no longer as vulnerable to the kind of famine conditions that shaped medieval life. These are significant achievements, and they should not be overlooked. What the comparison really highlights is a trade-off. Medieval bread was often closer to the original grain, slower to produce, and more directly connected to the environment. Modern bread is faster, more consistent, and more widely available. Each system reflects the priorities of its time. The medieval world valued survival, stability, and local adaptation. The modern world values efficiency, convenience, and scale. Interestingly, in recent years, there has been a quiet return to some of the older methods. Sourdough baking has regained popularity. Whole grain flours are once again appreciated. People are becoming more interested in how food is made, where it comes from, and how it affects the body over time. In a way, this reflects a growing awareness that something was lost in the transition to fully industrialized bread. This does not mean that we are returning to the medieval world. That would be neither practical nor desirable. But it does suggest that the medieval approach still has something to teach us. It reminds us that food is not just about appearance or convenience. It is about function, structure, and the relationship between the body and what it consumes. When you look at a medieval loaf, dense, slightly uneven, perhaps darker than what we are used to, it might not seem impressive at first. But that loaf carries with it a long history of adaptation, necessity, and practical knowledge. It represents a system that, despite its limitations, understood the importance of nourishment in a very direct way. And when you compare that to a modern, perfectly uniform slice of bread, soft and consistent from edge to edge, the difference becomes clear. One is shaped by time, environment, and human effort. The other is shaped by machines, markets, and modern expectations. Both feed people, but they do so in very different ways. In the final part of this story, we'll bring everything together by looking at what this long history reveals about our current relationship with food, and why something as simple as bread continues to carry deeper lessons about health, culture, and the way we live. As we bring this story to a close, it becomes clear that bread is far more than a simple food. It is a reflection of how a society understands nourishment, time, labor, and even value itself. The contrast between medieval bread and modern bread is not just about ingredients or techniques. It is about two very different systems of living, each shaping the food people depend on every day. In the medieval world, bread existed at the center of life. It was tied to the land, to the seasons, to the rhythms of work and rest. People understood, often in a very direct way, that the quality of their bread depended on the quality of their grain, their soil, their weather, and their effort. There was very little distance between production and consumption. Even those who did not grow their own grain lived within a system where food was visibly connected to its source. This created a kind of awareness that is difficult to replicate in modern societies. Because of this, bread carried a certain weight, both physically and culturally. It was dense, filling, and essential. It was also respected. Wasting bread was not taken lightly. In many places, there were customs around handling it properly, even small rituals that reflected its importance. Bread was not just eaten, it was valued. That sense of value influenced how it was made, how it was shared, and how it was understood within the community. Modern bread, by contrast, exists in a world of abundance and distance. Most people no longer see the fields where grain is grown or the mills where it is processed. Bread appears as a finished product, neatly packaged and ready to consume. This convenience is one of the great advantages of modern life. It saves time, reduces effort, and makes food widely accessible. But it also changes the relationship between people and what they eat. When food becomes highly processed and widely available, it can lose some of its meaning. Bread becomes just another item on a shelf, interchangeable with countless other options. It is no longer the foundation of the meal in the way it once was. It can be eaten quickly without much thought and replaced just as easily. This shift in perception is subtle, but it has real consequences. It affects how people think about nourishment, how they experience hunger and fullness, and how they make choices about what to eat. The idea that medieval bread was a kind of superfood is, in many ways, a modern interpretation. Medieval people did not use that language, and they did not approach food with the same analytical framework we use today. But if we step back and look at the broader picture, the comparison begins to make sense. Their bread was often closer to the original grain, less altered by processing, and produced through slower, more natural methods. It was designed, by necessity, to sustain human life in a demanding environment. Modern bread, especially in its most industrial forms, is designed for a different purpose. It prioritizes consistency, softness, shelf life, and immediate appeal. These are not inherently negative qualities, but they do represent a shift away from the kind of structural nourishment that characterized many traditional breads. The result is a product that can feel less substantial, even if it is more convenient. What this history reveals is not that one era was entirely right and the other entirely wrong, but that each reflects a different set of priorities. Medieval societies needed bread that could support hard physical labor and survive within a fragile agricultural system. Modern societies need bread that fits into fast-paced, urban lifestyles and complex global supply chains. Both needs are valid, but they lead to very different outcomes. There is also a deeper lesson here about time. Medieval bread took time to grow, to mill, to ferment, and to bake. That time was not seen as an inconvenience. It was simply part of the process. In the modern world, time is often treated as something to minimize. Processes are accelerated wherever possible. Bread is no exception. But when time is removed from food production, something changes. Flavor, texture, and even the way the body responds to food can be affected. This does not mean that modern bread cannot be nourishing. It can be, especially when it draws on some of the older principles, such as using whole grains or allowing for slower fermentation. What it does mean is that the industrial model is not the only way to make bread, and it may not always be the most satisfying way, even if it is the most efficient. In recent years, there has been a growing interest in reconnecting with these older methods. People are experimenting with sourdough starters, seeking out whole grain flours, and paying more attention to how bread is made. This is not a return to the medieval world, but it is a recognition that some of the practices developed out of necessity in the past still have value today. It suggests that the story of bread is not finished, but still evolving. If we step back even further, bread becomes a kind of lens through which we can view human history. It shows us how societies adapt to their environment, how technology changes daily life, and how cultural values shape something as basic as food. The medieval loaf and the modern slice are not just different in composition, they are expressions of different ways of living. So the next time you see a simple piece of bread, it may be worth remembering that it carries a long and complex history. Behind it are centuries of farming, milling, baking, and adaptation. Behind it are people who depended on it in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate today. And within it is a quiet reminder that even the most ordinary foods can tell extraordinary stories about who we are, where we have been, and how we choose to live. In the end, the comparison between medieval and modern bread is not just about which one is better. It is about understanding the systems that produce them. It is about recognizing that convenience and nourishment do not always move in the same direction. And it is about seeing, in something as familiar as bread, a deeper connection between past and present, between necessity and choice, and between the simple act of eating and the broader patterns of human history. And that, perhaps, is what makes this story so enduring. Bread has always been with us, changing as we change, reflecting our priorities, our technologies, and our understanding of what it means to be sustained. Whether in a medieval village or a modern city, it remains one of the clearest ways to see how history lives on in everyday life. If we take one final step back and look at the full arc of this story, what stands out most is not just the difference in bread itself, but the difference in how human beings relate to food across time. In the medieval world, bread was something you depended on in a very direct, almost personal way. It was shaped by forces you could see and feel, weather, soil, labor, and time. In the modern world, bread is often something you encounter at the end of a long and largely invisible process. It arrives finished, predictable, and detached from its origins. This distance has quietly changed expectations. Medieval people did not expect bread to be identical every day. Variation was normal. Some loaves were better than others. Some years were better than others. There was an understanding that food was part of a living system subject to change. Modern consumers, on the other hand, are used to consistency. Bread is expected to look the same, taste the same, and behave the same regardless of season or location. That expectation has driven the development of highly controlled production methods. But it has also narrowed the range of what bread can be. There is also a difference in how hunger and satisfaction are experienced. In a medieval context, meals were often simpler, and bread played a central role in creating a sense of fullness. A dense loaf, eaten slowly, could sustain a person through long periods of work. Hunger was not something to be constantly avoided with frequent snacking. It was part of the natural rhythm of life. Bread helped manage that rhythm by providing lasting energy. In contrast, modern eating patterns are often more fragmented. Food is available at almost any time, and bread is just one option among many. Because modern bread is often lighter and more refined, it may not create the same lasting sense of fullness. This can lead to a different relationship with hunger, one that is more immediate and less stable. Again, this is not simply about the bread itself, but about the system in which it exists. Another important difference lies in the idea of effort. Medieval bread required effort at every stage. Grain had to be grown, harvested, transported, milled, and baked, often within a local community. Even buying bread involved participation in a system that was visible and tangible. Modern bread, by contrast, requires very little effort from the consumer. It can be purchased quickly, stored easily, and consumed without preparation. This ease is one of the defining features of modern life, but it also changes how food is valued. When something requires effort, it often carries more meaning. Medieval bread was not just calories, it was the result of work. That work was understood and, in many cases, shared. Baking days, communal ovens, and local markets created a social context around bread. People were connected not only to the food itself, but to each other through the processes that produced it. Modern bread, while still part of social life in many ways, is less tied to these shared experiences. It is more individual, more private, and more disconnected from its origins. This shift also reflects broader changes in how societies think about health. Medieval people did not have the scientific tools to analyze nutrition in the way we do today. They relied on experience, tradition, and observation. If a certain kind of bread sustained people well, it continued to be made. If it did not, it was adjusted or abandoned. This was a practical, experience-based approach. Modern nutrition, by contrast, is highly analytical. It breaks food down into components, calories, carbohydrates, fiber, vitamins, and evaluates them in detail. This has led to important insights and improvements in public health. But it can also create a more fragmented view of food, where individual elements are emphasized over the whole. Medieval bread, with its less processed structure, naturally contained a balance of components that work together. Modern bread, especially when highly refined, may require fortification or adjustment to achieve a similar balance. One of the more interesting developments in recent decades is the way modern consumers have begun to rediscover some of these older ideas. There is a growing appreciation for foods that are less processed, more traditional, and more closely connected to their sources. Terms like whole grain, artisan, and slow fermentation have become more common, reflecting a desire to move away from purely industrial models of food production. This does not mean that society is returning to medieval practices, but it does suggest that the medieval approach still offers valuable lessons. It reminds us that food does not have to be perfect to be nourishing. It does not have to be uniform to be valuable, and it does not have to be fast to be effective. In fact, some of the qualities that modern systems try to eliminate, variation, density, complexity, may actually contribute to a more satisfying and sustaining experience of eating. There is also a broader cultural lesson here about balance. The modern world has achieved remarkable things in terms of food production. It has reduced scarcity, improved safety, and increased accessibility. These are real and important achievements. But in focusing so strongly on efficiency and scale, it has sometimes moved away from the slower, more grounded practices that once defined everyday life. Bread sits right at the center of this tension. It is both a basic necessity and a highly adaptable product. It can be made in simple ways or highly complex ones. It can be deeply nourishing or primarily convenient. The choices made in how bread is produced reflect larger priorities within society. And those priorities, in turn, shape how people experience food. If we return to the original question, why medieval bread might feel like a superfood compared to modern bread, the answer now feels more complete. It is not that medieval people had discovered a perfect formula. It is that their conditions led them to create bread that was structurally closer to its source, slower to develop, and more aligned with the demands of their daily lives. Modern bread, shaped by different conditions, often moves in the opposite direction. And yet, the story does not end in opposition. There is room for both approaches, and there is increasing evidence that combining the strengths of each may offer the best path forward. Modern knowledge can inform better choices about ingredients and methods, while traditional practices can remind us of the value of time, simplicity, and connection to the original food. In a quiet way, bread continues to evolve, just as it has for thousands of years. It reflects the world around it, adapting to new technologies, new tastes, and new understandings. But beneath all of that change, the basic idea remains the same. Bread is meant to sustain. It is meant to provide energy, stability, and a sense of completeness. And perhaps that is why this comparison resonates so strongly today. In a fast-moving world, there is something compelling about the idea of a food that is slower, more grounded, and more substantial. Medieval bread, in all its variety and imperfection, offers a glimpse of that possibility, not as something to return to entirely, but as something to learn from. So the next time you think about bread, whether it is a simple slice or a carefully baked loaf, it may be worth considering the long history behind it. The fields, the mills, the ovens, the hands that shaped it, and the many different ways it has sustained people across time. Because in the end, bread is not just a product. It is a story, one that connects the medieval past to the modern present, and continues to unfold with every loaf that is made. And if we follow that story just a little further, into the quiet details of everyday medieval life, we begin to see something even more revealing. Bread was not only central in a nutritional sense, it also shaped time itself. The day, the week, even the year were often organized around the processes that made bread possible. Grain had to be planted at the right moment, harvested carefully, dried, stored, and protected. Milling followed its own rhythm, dependent on water flow or wind strength. Baking required preparation, coordination, and shared access to ovens. None of these steps could be rushed without consequence. In that sense, bread imposed a natural discipline on life. It encouraged patience. It demanded attention, and it connected people to cycles that were larger than themselves. This is a very different relationship from the one most people have with bread today. Modern systems are designed to remove friction, to smooth out variability, and to make food available on demand. You do not need to think about the season, the harvest, or the mill. You simply purchase what you need when you need it. This convenience is powerful, but it also removes the sense of timing that once defined food production. In the medieval world, waiting was part of eating. Dough needed time to rise. Ovens needed time to heat. Grain needed time to grow. This waiting was not seen as inefficiency. It was understood as necessary, and because of that, food carried with it a sense of anticipation. Bread was not just consumed, it was awaited. There is also something important to notice about scale. Medieval bread was produced in relatively small quantities, often for a known group of people. Even in larger towns, production was limited by available resources and labor. This meant that bread remained closely tied to the needs of a specific community. If something went wrong, it was felt locally. If something went well, the benefits were shared locally as well. Modern bread production operates on a completely different scale. A single facility can produce thousands of loaves in a day, distributing them across large regions or even countries. This scale allows for efficiency and consistency, but it also creates distance. The person eating the bread is rarely connected to the people who made it. The process becomes abstract, almost invisible, and with that invisibility comes a shift in trust. Medieval people trusted bread because they understood, at least in general terms, how it was made. They knew the baker, the miller, or the farmer. They could see the process even if they did not control it. Modern consumers, by contrast, often rely on systems they cannot see. Trust is placed in regulation, branding, and packaging rather than in direct knowledge of production. This does not mean that modern bread is unsafe or untrustworthy. In many ways, it is far more regulated and controlled than medieval bread ever was. But the nature of trust has changed. It has moved from personal and local to institutional and systemic. And that shift can influence how people feel about the food they eat, even if they are not fully aware of it. Another layer to this story is the role of scarcity. In the medieval world, bread was sometimes limited. Poor harvests could reduce supply. Prices could rise. Access could become uneven. This scarcity made bread valuable in a very immediate sense. People understood its importance because they could imagine life without it. Modern societies, particularly in developed regions, have largely removed this kind of scarcity. Bread is abundant. It is relatively inexpensive. It is available in many forms. This abundance is one of the great achievements of modern agriculture and industry, but it also changes perception. When something is always available, it can feel less significant. It becomes easy to overlook. This shift from scarcity to abundance is one of the key reasons the comparison between medieval and modern bread can feel so striking. Medieval bread had to matter. It was too important not to. Modern bread, surrounded by countless alternatives, can sometimes feel optional. And when something feels optional, it is often treated with less care, both by producers and consumers. Yet despite all these differences, there is a continuity that runs through the entire history of bread. At its core, bread remains a simple combination of grain, water, and heat. That basic formula has not changed. What has changed is everything around it, the methods, the scale, the expectations, and the meaning. This continuity is part of what makes bread such a powerful historical subject. It allows us to see both change and stability at the same time. The medieval loaf and the modern slice share a common origin, but they exist in very different worlds. By comparing them, we can better understand how those worlds differ and what those differences mean. In a way, bread acts as a quiet record of human priorities. When societies prioritize survival and resilience, bread becomes dense, sustaining, and closely tied to the land. When societies prioritize efficiency and convenience, bread becomes lighter, faster, and more standardized. Neither approach is inherently right or wrong, but each reflects a different balance of needs. There is also something deeply human in the way bread continues to adapt. Even within modern systems, there is room for variation. Small bakeries, home bakers, and traditional methods continue to exist alongside industrial production. People still experiment with fermentation, with grain types, with techniques that echo older practices. This suggests that the story of bread is not a straight line from past to present, but a layered and ongoing process. And perhaps that is the most meaningful conclusion we can draw. The idea that medieval bread was somehow better or that modern bread is somehow worse simplifies a much more complex reality. What we are really seeing is a shift in context. Medieval bread fit the needs of its time. Modern bread fits the needs of ours. But within that shift, certain qualities have been lost and others have been gained. Understanding this helps us move beyond simple comparisons and toward a deeper appreciation of food as a cultural and historical phenomenon. It reminds us that what we eat is shaped by forces that extend far beyond the kitchen. It is shaped by technology, economics, environment, and social structure. Bread, in all its forms, carries those influences within it. So when we think about medieval bread as something close to a superfood, what we are really recognizing is a moment in history when necessity produced a kind of balance. A balance between grain and process, between time and nourishment, between effort and reward. That balance was not perfect, and it came with many challenges. But it offers a perspective that can still be valuable today. In the end, bread continues to do what it has always done. It feeds people, supports daily life. It adapts to changing conditions, and quietly, without drawing much attention to itself, it reflects the world in which it is made. Whether in a medieval village or a modern city, it remains one of the simplest and most enduring connections between human beings and the systems that sustain them. And if we let that idea settle for a moment, there's one final perspective worth considering: how bread, across all these centuries, quietly shaped not just bodies, but behavior, identity, and even stability within society. In the medieval world, bread was not just nourishment. It was order. Entire communities depended on its reliable production. When bread was plentiful and affordable, life felt stable. When it became scarce or expensive, tension followed quickly. There are countless historical records of unrest tied directly to bread shortages. Not because people preferred bread above all else, but because bread represented the baseline of survival. When that baseline was threatened, everything else became uncertain. This gives us an important insight into why medieval bread had to be as sustaining as possible. It was not simply about feeding individuals, it was about maintaining social balance. A loaf that could keep people full longer, that could stretch limited resources, that could be relied upon day after day, contributed to stability in a very real way. Bread was, in a sense, part of the infrastructure of medieval life, just as important as roads, tools, or shelter. Modern societies still depend on stable food systems, but the connection is less visible. Bread shortages are rare in most developed regions, and food supply chains are designed to absorb disruptions. As a result, bread no longer carries the same immediate sense of importance. It is one option among many, rather than the central pillar of daily sustenance. This shift has changed not only how bread is made, but how it is valued. There is also a cultural dimension that becomes clearer when we compare these two eras. In medieval Europe, bread was deeply embedded in identity. Different regions produced different types of bread, reflecting local grains, traditions, and techniques. These variations were not just practical, they were part of how communities understood themselves. Bread was local, recognizable, and specific. In the modern world, bread has become more universal. A loaf in one country can look and taste very similar to a loaf in another. This standardization has benefits, especially in terms of accessibility and trade, but it also reduces the sense of uniqueness that once defined bread. What was once a marker of place becomes a global product. And yet, despite this standardization, there is a growing awareness that something meaningful was tied to those older variations. When people seek out traditional breads today, whether it's a dense rye loaf, a long-fermented sourdough, or a stone-ground whole grain bread, they are often responding to more than just taste. They are responding to a sense of authenticity, of connection, of something that feels more grounded. This brings us back to the idea of medieval bread as a kind of superfood, not in the modern marketing sense, but in the sense of a food that was deeply integrated into life. It was not isolated, processed, and repackaged. It was part of a system that included land, labor, time, and community. Its value came from that integration. Modern bread, especially at its most industrial, tends to exist outside of that system. It is designed to function independently of local conditions, to remain consistent regardless of environment. This makes it incredibly efficient, but it also makes it less connected. The loaf becomes a product rather than a process. There is also something to be said about how this affects perception of health. Medieval people did not separate food into categories of healthy and unhealthy in the way we often do today. Food was judged by its ability to sustain, to satisfy, and to support daily life. Bread that did this well was valued. Bread that did not was a problem. Today, food is often evaluated through a more fragmented lens. We look at ingredients, labels, and nutritional data. This has its advantages, but it can also obscure the broader picture. A loaf of bread might meet certain criteria on paper while still failing to provide a sense of lasting nourishment. Conversely, a simpler, less processed loaf might offer that sense even if it does not fit neatly into modern categories. What the medieval example shows us is that structure matters. Not just what is in the bread, but how it is put together, how it is processed, and how it fits into a broader pattern of eating. Bread that is closer to its original form, that develops slowly, that retains more of the grain's natural complexity, tends to behave differently in the body, feels different, it satisfies differently. This is not a mystery so much as a consequence of process. When you slow something down, when you allow it to develop naturally, when you avoid breaking it apart more than necessary, you often preserve qualities that are difficult to recreate later. Medieval bread, shaped by necessity, often followed this path. At the same time, it's important to keep the full picture in mind. Medieval life was not easier or more comfortable. Food insecurity was real. Nutrition could be uneven. People did not have the variety or reliability that many enjoy today. The value of medieval bread comes from how it functioned within those constraints, not from any idealized version of the past. What makes this comparison meaningful is not that we should try to return to medieval conditions, but that we can learn from the balance those conditions created. A balance between simplicity and function, between time and efficiency, between local production and daily consumption. In many ways, modern society is already beginning to explore that balance again. There is a renewed interest in how food is made, in where it comes from, in how different processes affect the final product. Bread is often at the center of this exploration, precisely because it is so familiar and so fundamental. And perhaps that is why this topic resonates so strongly. Bread is something almost everyone knows, something almost everyone eats. It is ordinary in the best sense of the word. But within that ordinariness is a deep history, one that connects us to people who lived very differently, yet relied on the same basic food. When you look at a medieval loaf and a modern loaf side by side, the differences are clear. One is dense, varied, shaped by time and place. The other is uniform, consistent, shaped by technology and scale. But both are part of the same story, a story of adaptation, of survival, of human ingenuity. And that story continues. Every loaf baked today, whether in a large factory or a small kitchen, carries forward elements of the past. It reflects choices about ingredients, about methods, about priorities. It reflects what we value in food, whether that is convenience, consistency, flavor, or nourishment. So in the end, the question is not just why medieval bread might have felt more sustaining, but what that tells us about our own choices today. It suggests that the way food is made matters, that time and structure play a role, and that even something as simple as bread can reveal deeper truths about how we live. And as quiet as it may seem, that insight is what makes this history worth paying attention to. Because in understanding something as ordinary as bread, we begin to understand something much larger, how human beings shape their world, and how, in return, that world shapes them. And if we linger on that idea just a little longer, there is one more layer to uncover, how bread, across centuries, quietly influenced not only survival and society, but also human perception itself. The way people experience taste, texture, and even satisfaction was shaped by the kind of bread they ate every day. In the medieval world, taste was not engineered for immediate appeal. Bread was rarely sweet, rarely soft in the modern sense, and often required effort to chew. It developed flavor slowly through fermentation, through the character of the grain, and through the conditions in which it was baked. That meant taste was something that unfolded gradually. It was not designed to overwhelm the senses, but to sustain them. Modern bread, especially in its most common forms, tends to move in the opposite direction. It is often softer, milder, sometimes slightly sweetened, and designed to be immediately pleasant. This shift reflects a broader change in how food is experienced. Modern systems often prioritize instant satisfaction, foods that are easy to eat, easy to like, and easy to repeat. Bread has adapted to fit that expectation. But this change has consequences. When food is optimized for immediate appeal, it can become less satisfying over time. It may not hold attention in the same way. It may not provide the same depth of experience. Medieval bread, by contrast, demanded more engagement. It required slower eating, more chewing, and more awareness. In doing so, it created a different kind of relationship between the eater and the food. This difference in experience is subtle but important. It shapes how people understand fullness, how they pace their meals, and how they think about food in general. A dense, fermented loaf encourages a slower rhythm of eating. A soft, highly processed slice encourages speed and repetition. Over time, these patterns can influence habits in ways that are not immediately obvious. There is also the question of resilience. Medieval bread was not designed to be delicate. It had to survive handling, storage, and varying conditions. Could become stale and still be useful. Could be repurposed in different ways. This durability was a practical necessity, but it also meant that bread remained a stable part of the diet, even as conditions changed. Modern bread, while convenient, is often more fragile in a different sense. It is designed to maintain a specific texture for a limited time. Once that texture changes, it is often discarded. This reflects a shift in expectations. Bread is no longer expected to adapt. It is expected to remain the same, and when it doesn't, it is replaced. This shift ties back to the broader theme of control. Medieval systems operated with limited control over many variables. Weather, harvests, and local conditions all played a role. Bread reflected that uncertainty. Modern systems, by contrast, aim to control as many variables as possible. Bread becomes predictable, consistent, and uniform. This control is one of the defining features of modern food production. But with control comes a certain loss of flexibility. When a product is designed to be perfect in one specific way, it may struggle outside of those conditions. Medieval bread, by being less refined and more variable, was often more adaptable. It could fit into different contexts, different meals, and different stages of use. There is also an environmental dimension to consider. Medieval bread production was closely tied to local ecosystems. Grain was grown nearby, milled nearby, and baked nearby. This limited the scale of production, but it also created a direct relationship between food and environment. People were aware, sometimes painfully so, of how environmental changes affected their food supply. Modern bread production, with its global supply chains, operates on a much larger scale. Grain can be sourced from different regions, processed in centralized facilities, and distributed widely. This increases efficiency and reliability, but it also creates distance between production and consumption. The environmental impact becomes less visible, even if it remains significant. Again, this is not a simple matter of one system being better than the other. It is a matter of understanding how different systems create different outcomes. Medieval bread was shaped by limitation and locality. Modern bread is shaped by abundance and scale. Each brings its own advantages and challenges. What makes this comparison so compelling is that it invites reflection. It encourages us to look at something familiar in a new way. Bread is so common that it is easy to overlook, but when we examine it closely, it reveals a great deal about human history, technology, and culture. It also reminds us that food is not static. It changes as we change. The bread of the medieval world was not the same as the bread of ancient times, and the bread of today will not be the same as the bread of the future. Each generation reshapes it according to its needs and values. And yet, despite all these changes, there is a continuity that persists. The basic act of combining grain, water, and heat remains the same. The purpose of bread, to nourish, to sustain, to support daily life, remains the same. What changes is how that purpose is fulfilled. In a way, bread becomes a mirror. It reflects the priorities of the society that produces it. When survival is the priority, bread becomes dense, reliable, and sustaining. When convenience is the priority, bread becomes soft, quick, and consistent. When people begin to seek balance again, bread begins to change once more, incorporating elements of both approaches. This is why the idea of medieval bread as a superfood resonates, even if it is not technically precise. Captures a feeling that bread once played a more complete role in sustaining life. It was not just a source of calories, but a foundation of energy, structure, and stability. Modern bread, in its most industrial forms, often plays a narrower role. It fits into a larger system of food choices, many of which are designed for convenience and immediate satisfaction. But within that system, there is still space for change. There is still space for bread that is slower, more complex, and more connected to its origins. And perhaps that is the quiet conclusion of this entire journey. The story of bread is not just about the past. It is about the present and the choices we continue to make. It is about how we balance efficiency with nourishment, convenience with quality, and speed with time. Because in the end, bread is never just bread. It is a reflection of how we live, how we think, and how we understand the relationship between ourselves and the world that feeds us. And the next time you hold a piece of bread in your hand, whether it is a soft modern slice or a dense, rustic loaf, you are holding more than just food. You are holding a small piece of history, one that stretches back through centuries, shaped by countless hands, and still evolving with every generation. And as we reach the very end of this long journey, there is one final, quiet realization that brings everything together. Bread, perhaps more than any other everyday food, reveals how human beings adapt to their circumstances, not just physically, but culturally and mentally as well. In the medieval world, bread taught patience. It taught restraint. It taught people to live within limits. You could not rush the harvest. You could not hurry fermentation beyond a certain point without consequences. You could not separate food from effort. These limitations shaped behavior. They created a rhythm of life that was slower, more deliberate, and closely tied to necessity. That rhythm extended beyond food. It influenced how people worked, how they planned, and how they understood time itself. Bread was part of a broader system that required awareness and cooperation. Villages depended on shared ovens, shared resources, and shared knowledge. Even something as simple as baking became a collective act, reinforcing social bonds. Modern bread, in contrast, exists in a world that values speed, independence, and control. You do not need to wait for a harvest. You do not need to coordinate with others to bake. You do not need to understand the process in detail. Bread is available when you want it in the form you expect. This reflects a broader shift in how modern societies operate toward convenience, individual choice, and immediate access. But this shift also changes how people think about satisfaction. In the medieval world, satisfaction often came after effort. A meal, especially one centered around bread, was the result of time and work. That gave it a certain weight, a certain meaning. In the modern world, satisfaction is often immediate but also more fleeting. Food is easier to obtain, but sometimes less deeply experienced. This difference is not always obvious, but it can be felt. A dense, slowly made loaf invites a different kind of eating. It encourages smaller bites, longer meals, and a more gradual sense of fullness. A soft, highly processed slice can be eaten quickly, almost without noticing. It fits into a faster pace of life, but it may not create the same lasting impression. There is also something important about memory. Medieval bread was consistent within its variability. It changed with seasons and conditions, but it remained recognizable within a community. People grew up with certain types of bread, certain flavors, certain textures. These became part of their identity, part of their sense of home. Modern bread, because of its standardization, creates a different kind of memory. It is consistent across regions and even countries. This can be comforting in its own way, but it also reduces the diversity that once defined bread. The connection between food and place becomes less distinct. And yet, despite all these changes, the human response to bread remains surprisingly constant. People still seek out bread that feels satisfying, that feels real, that feels connected to something beyond simple consumption. This is why traditional baking methods continue to attract interest. It is why people are drawn to the idea of slower fermentation, of whole grains, of bread that requires time and attention. In a sense, this is not a new trend, but a rediscovery. It is a recognition that some of the qualities shaped by medieval necessity still resonate today. Not because we want to return to that world, but because we recognize something valuable in how it approached food. What medieval bread shows us, more than anything, is that nourishment is not just about what is eaten, but how it is made and how it is experienced. It is about structure, time, and context. It is about the relationship between the food and the person eating it. Modern bread, for all its advantages, sometimes separates these elements. It delivers food efficiently, but not always meaningfully. It provides calories, but not always a sense of completeness. This is not a failure, but a reflection of priorities. And those priorities can change, because ultimately the story of bread is not fixed. It continues to evolve, shaped by new technologies, new knowledge, and perhaps that is the most important takeaway. The question is not whether medieval bread was better or whether modern bread is worse. The question is what we want bread to be moving forward. Do we want it to be purely convenient, or do we want it to carry some of the depth and substance it once had? Do we want it to be uniform, or do we value variation and character? These are not just questions about bread. They are questions about how we approach food, time, and daily life. Bread simply makes those questions easier to see. So as we close this documentary, it's worth returning to where we began, with something simple, something familiar. A loaf of bread. It sits quietly on the table, easy to overlook. But within it is a long history of human effort, adaptation, and understanding. From medieval fields and communal ovens to modern factories and supermarket shelves, bread has changed with us. It has reflected our needs, our technologies, and our values. And in doing so, it has remained one of the clearest windows into how we live. Not dramatic, not complicated, just consistent, enduring, and deeply connected to the human story. And even after everything we've explored, there's still one more quiet truth worth sitting with. Something that only becomes clear when you step completely outside the details and look at the full human picture. Bread, across history, has never really been just about food. It has been about trust. In the medieval world, trust was built into the system in a very direct way. You trusted the land to produce grain. You trusted the seasons to follow their course. You trusted the miller not to take more than his share, and the baker not to dilute the dough. In many towns, strict rules governed bread making. Weights, prices, and quality were regulated because bread mattered too much to leave entirely to chance. If bread failed, trust failed with it. This is why medieval authorities often monitored bakers closely, not out of abstract concern, but because bread was tied directly to public stability. A dishonest baker, or poor quality bread, could lead to unrest. People depended on bread in a way that made its integrity essential. In that sense, bread was part of a social contract. It connected individuals, communities, and systems of authority. Modern bread still relies on trust, but in a very different form. Today, trust is placed in institutions rather than individuals. We trust food safety regulations, manufacturing standards, and supply chains that operate far beyond our immediate view. We trust labels, brands, and systems of inspection. This trust is more complex, more distant, and often more abstract. And yet, when that trust is questioned, even slightly, people begin to look back towards simpler, more transparent methods. This is part of the reason traditional baking has regained attention. It offers something that feels more understandable, more visible. You can see the ingredients. You can observe the process. You can reconnect in a small way with how food is made. This doesn't mean modern systems are flawed at their core. In many ways, they are more reliable than anything in the past. But they operate on a different kind of trust, one that requires belief in systems rather than direct experience. Medieval bread, by contrast, existed within a framework where trust was built through familiarity and proximity. There's also something deeper happening beneath all of this. Bread reflects how societies handle uncertainty. In the medieval period, uncertainty was constant. Weather could change outcomes dramatically. Harvests could fail. Storage could go wrong. Bread had to be resilient enough to withstand these uncertainties. That's part of why it was often dense, varied, and adaptable. It was built not for perfection, but for reliability under imperfect conditions. Modern systems aim to eliminate uncertainty wherever possible. Grain can be sourced globally if one region has a poor harvest. Production can be adjusted quickly. Storage and preservation technologies reduce risk. Bread becomes consistent, stable, and predictable. But in removing uncertainty, something else changes. Food becomes less responsive to local conditions and more shaped by centralized systems. Bread no longer reflects the immediate environment in the same way. It reflects a network. This is neither entirely positive nor entirely negative. It simply represents a different approach to solving the same problem: how to feed people reliably. What medieval bread teaches us is that resilience often comes from simplicity and adaptability. What modern bread shows us is that stability can come from control and scale. Both approaches work, but they produce very different experiences. And that brings us, finally, to the human experience itself. Because at the end of the day, bread is not just something we analyze, it's something we feel. The way it sits in the stomach, the way it satisfies hunger, the way it pairs with other foods, the way it fits into daily routines. These are not abstract qualities. They are immediate, physical, and personal. A medieval loaf, dense and slightly uneven, might not look appealing by modern standards, but it engages the body differently. It requires more chewing, more time, more awareness. It releases energy slowly. It lingers. It becomes part of a longer rhythm of eating and working. A modern slice, soft and uniform, fits seamlessly into a faster rhythm. It's easy to consume, easy to combine with other foods, easy to repeat. It matches a world where time is limited and efficiency is valued. Neither is inherently wrong, but they are not interchangeable. They belong to different ways of living, and perhaps that's the most important realization of all. The question isn't just why medieval bread might have felt more nourishing. The question is, what kind of life was it nourishing? A life built around physical labor, seasonal cycles, shared resources, and slower time. And in contrast, what kind of life does modern bread support? A life built around speed, convenience, individual choice, and global systems. Bread, in this sense, becomes a quiet reflection of human priorities. Change the priorities and the bread changes with them. So when people today feel that something about modern bread is missing, they may not just be reacting to ingredients or processing. They may be sensing a deeper shift, a movement away from food that demands time and attention toward food that fits into a faster, more fragmented world. And that feeling, whether fully understood or not, is part of why this topic continues to resonate. Because it's not really about bread alone. It's about connection to food, to process, to time, and to the systems that sustain us. Medieval bread reminds us of a world where that connection was unavoidable. Modern bread shows us a world where that connection can be optional. And somewhere between those two extremes lies the question of balance. Not a return to the past, but a recognition of what the past can still teach. That food, even something as simple as bread, carries more than nutrition, carries history, carries meaning, and quietly, it carries the imprint of how we choose to live. And that is where the story truly ends, not with a conclusion, but with an awareness. An awareness that the next loaf, wherever it comes from, is part of that same long story, still evolving, still adapting, still in its own quiet way telling us who we are. And as we settle into that awareness, there is one last dimension that quietly completes the picture, how bread across time shapes not just how people eat, but how they understand what it means to be sustained at all. In the medieval world, being sustained was a very physical concept. It meant having enough strength to work, enough energy to endure, and enough food to carry you through uncertainty. Bread was measured not by how pleasant it was, but by how well it supported life. If it kept you going through a long day, if it held off hunger, if it allowed you to continue your tasks, then it had done its job. This created a very direct relationship between food and function. Bread was not expected to entertain. It was expected to sustain. Its success was measured over hours, not moments. It was part of a longer cycle: eat, work, rest, repeat. And because of that, it fit naturally into the structure of medieval life. Modern bread exists within a very different framework. Today, food is often expected to do more than sustain. It is expected to be enjoyable, convenient, and immediately satisfying. It is part of a culture that values experience as much as function. Bread is no longer just a source of energy, but part of a broader landscape of taste, preference, and choice. This shift changes how people evaluate food. A loaf that is dense and slow to eat might be seen as less appealing, even if it provides longer-lasting energy. A loaf that is soft and easy might be preferred, even if it does not sustain in the same way. The criteria have changed, and with them the nature of bread itself. But there is a subtle tension here, because while modern food culture emphasizes immediate satisfaction, the human body still responds to food in ways that are shaped by longer-term needs. It still benefits from structure, from balance, from foods that release energy steadily rather than quickly. This is where the contrast with medieval bread becomes most noticeable. Medieval bread, by necessity, aligned more closely with those longer-term needs. It was built to support endurance. Modern bread, especially in its most processed forms, often aligns more closely with short-term preferences. It satisfies quickly, but may not sustain as deeply. This does not mean that modern bread cannot be nourishing. It can be, particularly when it incorporates elements that were once standard: whole grains, slower fermentation, less intensive processing. What it means is that the dominant model of bread production has shifted toward a different set of priorities. And those priorities reflect a broader cultural pattern. Modern life is faster, more segmented, and more flexible. Meals are often shorter. Eating is more frequent but less structured. Food is one part of a busy day, rather than the central anchor it once was. Bread has adapted to fit that pattern. In the medieval world, bread helped define the day. In the modern world, bread fits into the day. That difference, simple as it sounds, carries a great deal of meaning. It also helps explain why there is a growing interest in slowing things down, even within modern contexts. People are beginning to notice that food made with more time and attention often feels different. It may not be as convenient, but it can be more satisfying. It can create a stronger sense of completeness. This is not a rejection of modern life, but a response to it. A way of reintroducing some of the balance that existed when food and time were more closely connected. Bread, once again, sits at the center of that conversation, because it is simple enough to understand, but complex enough to reflect deeper patterns. Can be made quickly or slowly, can be refined or whole, can be standardized or unique. Each choice leads to a different outcome. And in those choices, we can see the ongoing evolution of how people relate to food. If medieval bread represents a world where necessity guided decisions, and modern bread represents a world where convenience often leads, then the present moment may represent something in between. A search for balance, a recognition that efficiency has value, but so does depth. That consistency is useful, but so is variation. That speed is important, but so is time. Bread, in its quiet way, allows us to explore that balance without needing to change everything else. It offers a small, tangible way to reconnect with older principles, even within a modern framework. And perhaps that is why this topic continues to resonate across cultures and generations. Because it speaks to something fundamental, not just about food, but about how people live. It asks simple questions with complex answers. What does it mean to be nourished? What does it mean to feel satisfied? What role should time play in the things we consume? And how much of our experience is shaped by the systems we build around us? Medieval bread does not provide direct answers to these questions, but it provides context. It shows us one way in which those questions were once resolved under very different conditions. Modern bread shows us another, and between them we are left with a clearer understanding of the possibilities. So as this story finally comes to rest, there is no single conclusion to hold on to, no simple rule to follow. Only a deeper awareness of how something as ordinary as bread can carry extraordinary meaning. It reminds us that even the most familiar parts of daily life are shaped by history, by necessity, and by choice, and that within those everyday details, there is always more to discover. Because in the end, bread is not just about the past or the present. It is about continuity, a continuous thread that runs through human life, connecting generations, adapting to change, and quietly sustaining us along the way. And that thread, simple as it may seem, is one of the strongest links we have to the story of who we are and how we continue to live. And if we allow that idea of continuity to settle, there is one final reflection that brings a kind of quiet closure to the entire story. How bread reveals not only how we live, but how we define what is enough. In the medieval world, enough was a clear and immediate concept. Enough bread meant you could work, you could endure, you could survive. There was very little distance between having enough and not having it. That clarity shaped behavior in profound ways. People valued food differently because the margin for error was small. Bread was not just present in life, it defined its limits. Because of this, medieval bread was built around sufficiency. It did not need to be perfect. It needed to be reliable. It needed to fill the gap between hunger and strength. And in doing so, it became something deeply practical, almost quiet in its purpose. It did not compete with other foods. It anchored them. In the modern world, the idea of enough has become more complex. Food is abundant in many places, and bread is rarely the sole foundation of a meal. Instead, it is one option among many. The question is no longer just whether bread sustains, but whether it satisfies preferences, taste, texture, convenience, variety. This shift introduces a different kind of relationship with food. When survival is no longer the primary concern, attention moves toward experience. Bread becomes something to enjoy, to choose, to compare. And while this brings freedom, it also introduces a certain distance from the original purpose of food. Because when everything is available, it becomes harder to define what is truly sufficient. Medieval bread, in its density and simplicity, made that definition clear. Provided what was needed, and in many cases little more. Modern bread, in its variety and refinement, offers more options, but sometimes less clarity. And this is where the comparison becomes most meaningful. It is not about idealizing the past or criticizing the present. It is about recognizing that different systems produce different understandings of value. Medieval bread taught people to recognize sufficiency. Modern bread often encourages them to seek optimization, better taste, better texture, better convenience. Neither approach is inherently wrong, but they lead to different experiences of eating. There is also something to be said about attention. In the medieval world, food demanded attention because it was tied to effort. You noticed bread because it mattered. You felt its absence, its quality, its presence in daily life. In the modern world, food often blends into the background. It is consumed while doing other things quickly, sometimes without full awareness. Bread reflects this shift as well. A loaf that requires cutting, chewing, and time invites attention. A slice that is soft and ready encourages speed. Over time, these small differences shape habits, and habits shape perception. This is not a criticism of modern life, but a reflection of its pace. When time becomes limited, food adapts. Bread becomes easier to eat, easier to store, easier to access. It fits into a world where attention is divided. But even within that world, there are moments where people begin to notice the difference. A slower meal, a more substantial loaf, a sense of fullness that lasts longer than expected. These moments are small, but they are revealing. They suggest that beneath all the changes, the human response to food remains connected to certain underlying patterns. We still recognize when something sustains us well. We still notice when something feels complete. And this brings us back once again to the medieval loaf, not as a model to replicate exactly, but as an example of what happens when food is shaped primarily by necessity. It becomes focused. It becomes functional. It becomes aligned with the basic needs of the body. Modern bread, shaped by different priorities, expands in other directions. It becomes more varied, more refined, more adaptable to different lifestyles. But in doing so, it sometimes moves away from that original focus. The space between those two approaches is where the story lives. It is where questions emerge. What do we want from food? What do we expect it to do? And how much of that expectation is shaped by habit rather than need? Bread, in its simplicity, makes these questions easier to see. Because it has existed in so many forms, across so many contexts, it allows us to compare without abstraction. We can look at it, taste it, feel it, and understand the differences directly. And in doing so, we begin to see that food is not just about consumption. It is about relationship, a relationship between people and their environment, between effort and reward, between time and satisfaction. Medieval bread represents one version of that relationship, close, immediate, shaped by necessity. Modern bread represents another, distant, efficient, shaped by choice. Neither is complete on its own, but together they offer a fuller picture. And perhaps that is the quiet conclusion of everything we've explored. Not that one kind of bread is superior, but that each reflects a different balance of values, a different way of organizing life around the simple act of eating. So when we think about why medieval bread might have felt like a superfood, what we are really noticing is that it was deeply aligned with the needs of its time. It was not enhanced or marketed. It was simply built to do its job well. And that clarity of purpose, of function, of connection is something that still resonates. Because even in a world of abundance, there is something reassuring about food that feels sufficient, that feels complete, that feels like it does exactly what it is meant to do. Bread has always carried that potential, and it continues to do so quietly in the background of daily life, unchanged at its core, yet constantly evolving around the edges. A simple food shaped by complex systems, a familiar object carrying an unfamiliar depth, and a reminder that sometimes the most ordinary things are the ones that reveal the most, if we take the time to notice them. And that, finally, is where the story comes to rest. And as we bring everything gently to a close, it's worth returning to the simplest image of all. A single loaf of bread resting on a table. Across centuries, that image has meant very different things to different people. To a medieval farmer, it meant survival for another day. To a monk, it fit into a rhythm of discipline and routine. To a laborer, it meant enough strength to continue working. Bread was not questioned. It was trusted. It was necessary. And because it was necessary, it was made in a way that reflected that responsibility. It was slower, heavier, less refined, sometimes imperfect, but it was real in a very direct sense. It came from the land, passed through human hands, and arrived at the table with very little distance between its origin and its purpose. It did not try to be anything more than what it needed to be. That is what made it powerful. Not in a modern sense of optimization or enhancement, but in its quiet ability to sustain. Modern bread, by contrast, sits in a different world entirely. It is part of a system that values speed, consistency, and accessibility. It is designed to meet expectations quickly and reliably. It looks the same, feels the same, and behaves the same no matter where you are. And that consistency is, in many ways, an achievement. But it also creates a different experience. Because when something becomes effortless, it can also become unnoticed. Bread is no longer the center of the meal for many people. It is an addition, convenience, something that can be replaced without much thought. It no longer carries the same weight it once did, because life no longer depends on it in the same way. And yet, when we compare the two, medieval bread and modern bread, we begin to notice something deeper than just ingredients or methods. We notice a shift in priorities. Medieval bread was shaped by necessity. It had to nourish, had to last, had to support real physical demands. Modern bread is shaped by preference. It has to appeal, to fit into busy lives, to be easy and predictable. Neither is wrong, but they are not the same. And that difference explains why medieval bread can feel, even from a distance, more substantial, almost like what we might now call a superfood. Not because it was designed that way, but because it had to be. It had to carry people through long days, uncertain seasons, and physically demanding lives. It had to work in the most practical sense of the word. Modern bread, in many cases, no longer carries that same burden. It exists in a world where food is abundant, where meals are varied, and where bread is just one part of a much larger system. It does not need to do everything, and so it often does less. But within that difference lies a quiet opportunity, because understanding how bread has changed allows us to see that it is not fixed, can move in different directions depending on what we value. We can choose speed or we can choose time. We can choose refinement or we can choose structure. We can choose convenience or we can choose connection. Bread can take all of these forms. And that means the story of bread is not something that ended in the medieval period or the industrial age. It is something that continues, shaped by the choices people make every day. The medieval loaf reminds us of a time when food was closely tied to life itself, when nourishment was not abstract, but immediate and essential. The modern loaf reminds us of what happens when systems grow larger, faster, and more efficient. And somewhere between those two, there is space for balance. a space where bread can be both accessible and meaningful, both consistent and substantial, both modern and connected to its origins. That balance is not something imposed by history. It is something shaped in the present. And perhaps that is the most important insight of all. Because in the end, bread is not just a reflection of the past. It is a reflection of us, of how we live, of what we prioritize, of how we understand something as simple and as essential as being nourished. So the next time you see a loaf of bread, whether it's soft and uniform or dense and rustic, it may be worth pausing for a moment to recognize that behind it is a long and quiet history, one that stretches back through medieval fields, communal ovens, and generations of hands that shaped it not for comfort, but for survival. And that even now, in a very different world, that history still lingers, subtle, almost invisible, but still present. Bread has changed, but its story hasn't ended. It simply continues, one loaf at a time,